For everyone who's here tonight, over on the side table, we have the presentation that I have here in terms of the PowerPoint that you'll see behind me. We also have, and actually this was quite a chore to go back and look at your existing zones for your districts. We did not get a perfect file for these. The outline of the boundaries is exactly right, we're sure of that, but the interior districts we actually had to draw by hand in order to come up with these. And so you'll see in these large printouts the 5 different divisions of your overall healthcare district that's on here. And so one of the callers mentioned in reference to Division 5, that's what she was talking about. And so we're pretty confident that these lines are really close. They may be a little bit off, but the reality is we know we're going to new lines, so it's not a huge concern, but generally we know we're in the ballpark here. I just want to make sure I called that out. And so over on the side table, you'll see maps of what we believe are the current districts, as well as the PowerPoint tonight, so everyone's singing off the same sheet of music. So, any questions on that? Everyone good in terms of data and everything? Okay. So in your case, we just want to talk about what is redistricting overall. And redistricting is the process that governmental entities go through all around the country, usually following right after the census. Now, this process has really, the pandemic has played havoc on redistricting overall throughout California. Most of the time we'd be done with most of this by now throughout the state, but a lot of stuff was delayed because the census was delayed. And I know a lot of people have been very critical of the Census Bureau overall as they've been collecting this data, but those people worked really hard under some pretty terrible circumstances to gather this data, and they really are professionals in terms of the way they did it. And when we talk about redistricting in the census, we'll talk about in a second, some people will say, well, I don't like the census results. Well, that's very fine, and you can have your opinion on that, but the census is the census, and we don't have any other data to be able to use for redistricting. And so there are a couple very strange exceptions in case law and in redistricting history where they've been able to use other data sets, but I don't think any of those special circumstances apply here to your healthcare district. So, but the idea is that you want one person to have one vote. If I am a resident of a district with 500 people and you're a resident of a district with 10,000 people, my vote counts way more proportionally than you do, and that's unfair. And our Supreme Court has ruled that to be unfair. Yes, sir?
So when you're saying districts, so we've known them to be zones, right? So are you saying zones or districts?
I should be using zones in your case. I often default to district, but it's the same principle.
Okay.
Same principle.
So you could utilize that.
Yes, I will try, and you can throw things at me if I don't. But I'm habitually talking about districts, and I will try to stop that. But the idea still is the same, whether it be by zone or trustee area, as oftentimes school districts are called, or districts. The idea is that each person has an equal opportunity to elect somebody in that area. Now, oftentimes people come up and say, well, it's not an equal number of registered voters. No, it is not. When we do districting, we do it by every living heartbeat within that entity, and that's how we determine population equality, and we're going to talk about that more later. I talked to a subcommittee of the board here before my presentation, and tonight in preparation for this process. And even though the Fair Maps Act and the State Redistricting Commission, none of those principles directly and the law directly apply to your special district. They're totally separate. However, with the state, and I worked very hard on the campaign to create the State Redistricting Commission and going through that process professionally, there is a gold standard now in terms of public participation, in terms of the way redistricting processes go, and they've really set it. And the idea is that when you go through the redistricting process, it needs to be open and transparent all the way through with standards that we set for public participation, that the public can view the process, participate in the process, submit their own maps, comment on other people's maps, whether they like them or hate them or anywhere in between. That standard has been set. And so when a lot of special districts I work for, sometimes they have lots of people who come to testify, sometimes it's none. But the reality is the process all along the way needs to be open and transparent for the public to be involved. So once again, these laws don't apply to you in terms of Prop 11 and Prop 20 for statewide redistricting and the California Fair Maps Act, which only applies to cities and counties. But the principles about openness and transparency are really transporting their way to special districts all over the state.
Matt?
Yes.
Yeah, if I could just interject, give our audience some context, as I overheard a question here, and it kind of pertains also to what Garth had said. So the Kaweah Delta Healthcare District is 183 square miles. It is a single district, the healthcare district, that encompasses Visalia, Goshen, and parts of Farmersville and Ivanhoe. It is then divided up into 5 zones.
5 zones.
Inside that single healthcare district. And the people that live in each of those 5 zones elect their hospital board member, which are these 5 board members here. So healthcare districts can have 5 zones, 7 zones, 9 zones, 11 zones if they petition, but most every healthcare district, there are 35 healthcare districts in the state of California. Kaweah Delta is the largest of all the healthcare districts, but we choose, and most every healthcare district has 5 board members in 5 zones.
So that is a perfect segue into what I was going to say next. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
On your website, do you not refer to them as districts?
No,
zones?
we call them zones.
Okay.
There's only, but that's what makes us, different than congressional districts. That's where you hear the term. Even the county has districts, not zones, but we are one single district, and we are surrounded by other healthcare districts. There's the Tulare Healthcare District, the Exeter Healthcare District, the Alta Healthcare District, the Lindsay Healthcare District, the Sierra View Healthcare District are all in Tulare County, and we kind of butt up against each other. So we're always, at least right now, we're the same 183 square miles that we've been since 1961, in which the district was formed.
Okay.
So we're just talking about the 5 zones inside that healthcare district, how we will redraw those
Got
lines.
that. Got it. Yeah, BUSD has areas. They just call them areas
Gotcha.
within the district. But okay.
And I will once again try to remember zones. I'm trying. I really am. It's not going very well, but I'm trying. But his point is a really good one, because oftentimes you hear people talking about redistricting and reapportionment, and they use those 2 terms interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. Redistricting is the idea of breaking up a district or a state or a county into different districts or zones, or however you want to look at it. Reapportionment, it happens very quickly after the census data is given to the clerk of the House of Representatives, and they apportion members of Congress, congressional seats among the different states. So you're going to have, when we finish this process, we're not suddenly going to end up with 6 board members or 8 or 9 or 3, right? We're going to have 5, because we're just simply dividing it into 5 equal zones as we're going through this process. And so sometimes people say, well, I'm going to the reapportionment meeting. Well, no, you're not. That's over. That's not happening, because we're redistricting. Similar, this is a famous slide for those of you who are involved in the Garrymander. This is an old historical slide that most redistricting commission meetings. It's a famous slide. This district that was drawn it's a political cartoon of this terrible looking Garrymander of a district that kind of wrapped around there in Massachusetts, and they blamed the Governor Gary for that. So really quickly, I'm going to talk about the 5 principles of redistricting, and then I'm going to go into each one of these in a little bit more detail. The 5 principles of redistricting that we're going to deal with are population equality. So you need to divide the zones and make them of equal population. We have consideration under the Federal Voting Rights Act. And this morning I was doing a presentation, and there was a lot of confusion regarding the California Voting Rights Act and the Federal Voting Rights Act. We can get into that if need be. But we're here talking about the Federal Voting Rights Act, Section 2 explicitly. We have communities of interest. We have the idea of compactness, which shouldn't be too much of an issue. It's not too much of an issue in California. And then we have the issue of contiguity, the whole idea that you can't have little random spots all throughout Tulare County and just say, well, that's a district, in terms of the way they're drawn. So population equality, this is my hypothetical example of a state, county, city, special district with 100,000 people, and they would then have 5 districts of 20,000 people each. And this is just to illustrate population equality. So in my example, because you get on population equality, it doesn't have to be right down to the person for special districts. For members of Congress, it's actually down to one person on the census. Each member of the 52 members of Congress after this next election from California will represent within one person the same size district under the census. That's not the case for you and special districts and legislators and city councils and boards of supervisors. You take the mean and you get 5% on either side, so a total variation of 10%, right? And in this case, if it was 20,000, that means a district can have as few as 19,000 people or as many as 21,000 people. And when I look at this here, I see 5 districts. They're not all of equal size. The highest number is District 1. It has 5% over the mean population. And District 4 has 3.75% below the equal population. And in my language, that's a total spread of 8.75%. So we'd say that complies with the law generally. But you want to have that number be as close to 0 as possible. If it's going to be that big, you really have to have a good reason for that. Now, let me just throw out an example for you in terms of why you wouldn't want to make them exactly equal. Say to make them exactly equal, you end up with only 5 people who are in one neighborhood or on the other side of a major highway, or 5 people that wouldn't be, normally would all be in the same school district, but we're just going to take 5 people off a cul-de-sac and throw them in to make it equal. That doesn't make a lot of sense when those people should be with the rest of the people on their cul-de-sac or on their street or with their school district. So the law gives you some ability to be able to adjust those numbers. It doesn't have to be exactly right to allow communities of interest to be kept together. So that's the reason that they do that. Yes?
Could District 1 in that example go up to 6% and it would still be a range of 10%, or does it have to be 5% within the mean?
Yes, you're 100% right. The total variance is 10%. Oftentimes, and I do it too, and it's sometimes easier to say it's 5% on either side of the mean, but the reality is the true legal definition is a total variance of 10%. So you could have one district that would be 9. Well, actually, you couldn't do 9, 1, and 1, but you could do 6, and then you could have 4 at the bottom end, and that would be fine. But once again, if your spread's going to be 10% and that big, you've got to have a really good reason for that. And an example of a really good reason that I'm dealing with, or just finished dealing with, was in Butte County. For those of you who are familiar with this community of Paradise, completely burned down, right? They had all these people who left. They have a really good reason to undercount the population of Paradise within their supervisorial district because they know people are going to come back. They know that for sure. But even with that huge destruction of that community because of the fire, they still stuck within the 10% range. But I don't anticipate anyone's going to go in there and say, hey, your range is 9%, that's horrible. The only reason, all the other districts are generally the same. They're like 1 or 2% over. But Paradise's district is like 9% under or 8% under, and that makes sense.
That leads to another question I have. So
okay.
What about future population growth? Do we have to take that into account? How does that work?
You don't have to take it into account. You can.
Why still?
No, because it's so speculative in terms of housing, in terms of what happens. But the reality is that's a decision for this board to make in terms of how they want to do it. But I will tell you, the numbers that it's going to be judged by are the Census Bureau numbers from April 1st of 2020. And people say, well, we just had a new development that was built in the intervening year. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's the census data. That's what we have to use. But you very well might be justified to say, well, in this one district that we have, well, for example, we took District 4 down by 3.75% because we know there's 750 people that are coming, but you still can't go outside the zone of the 10%. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
This was simply the total deviation. We kind of already talked about that in terms of equal districts and not equal districts. Equality is not required because strict adherence to numeric goals isn't really required because you want to keep communities of interest together. Okay, so now the second most important issue in districting, any way you want to look at it, is the Federal Voting Rights Act. And Federal Voting Rights Act Section 2 is what people say, well, we're not talking about federal offices here. Doesn't matter. We can be talking about school boards, city councils, whatever. The Voting Rights Act Section 2 still rules today. And the historical reason for this is When this was adopted back in the 60s originally, there was a long history of states in the southern portion of the United States discriminating against African Americans and either dividing up the African American community in many different districts so they did not have an opportunity to elect an African American member of the school board, city council, Congress, legislature, whatever, or they should have had more than one representative, but instead they just packed all, it's called cracking, the first thing I talked about, which is splitting a community all up into pieces that should have been able to get 50% of a district, and that's cracking, or packing, which is to say, well, they could have had 2 districts, but instead we put all of them in one district and then we cracked all the way around. So there was a history of doing that. The law's been set up and there's several factors that we have to look at to be able to determine whether the Voting Rights Act is being met. So you say, well, what does that have to do with what we're talking about? When we talk about equal population, which we just finished discussing, we're talking about every living heartbeat in your district and in your zone, right? We count every single person, newborn child, citizen, non-citizen, senior, everyone counts. When we talk about the Voting Rights Act, you're going to see numbers from me, and you actually see them on the maps, because what we're looking for is, and I'll just show you here really quickly, what we look at under the Voting Rights Act is called Citizens Voting Age Population, and you'll hear me use the term CVAP, a Citizens Voting Age Population. That is those people who are citizens and are over the age of 18. That is the number that you look, and that's by the Ninth Circuit and the United States Supreme Court in terms of the appropriate number to determine Voting Rights Act districts. Now, some people say, well, that doesn't mean that those people are going to win for sure because it's not registered, or it's not the measurement of registered voters. 100% true, but the law requires citizens voting age population. So at the bottom of all these maps, and every map that my team will produce for you, you will see the different citizens voting age population numbers by the different ethnicities here on the side of the map. Because for the Voting Rights Act, that's the important part. Gentlemen, am I pointing the right thing? Everyone tracking with me here? You tracking, gentlemen? Okay, good deal. So we have those for all the different districts, and the magical number here is 50%, right? So you would like to have citizens voting age population ideally in an area of being 50%. Now, you have a couple districts that are really close, and as we go through this analysis, we may be in the situation where we need to look carefully to see whether there's an opportunity to get them over 50%. But you do have one district that the woman mentioned earlier that is Division 5, that's 62% CVAP. Now, some people might say that number is too high. That population should be spread out among several districts and not all consolidated in one. And that'll be part of our analysis as we go through this process and figure it out. But the idea, and actually, the only issue in the California Central Valley, there's not enough African Americans or Asian residents to control any sort of district. And so oftentimes when I'm talking about CVAP for the Voting Rights Act and analysis of that, it's always Latinos in the Central Valley. They're the ones that are large enough to have a population where they could get to 50% CVAP of a district. Yes, ma'am.
What is the raw percentage or the percentage of Latinos vis-a-vis the total population?
Well, let me see. I believe, trying to see if I have a, so on the handout you have,
I'm seeing it.
it's by district. Yes, you're right. And I don't think I would have to add that all up, but I have CVAP, but I would have to do that for you by zone.
But you're pretty sure we're dealing with greater than 50%.
Well, I'm not confident that it's greater than 50% across the whole district, but you can draw zones in such a way that they can reach 50%. So it wouldn't matter, and maybe I should have talked in greater detail about this. So the key principle is, and it could be Latino or Asian or African American, if there's a concentrated area of a community that has a large CVAP population of African American, Asian, Native Americans, Latinos, and a district can be drawn in such a way that that district can get to 50% CVAP, you're required under the law to do that, assuming there's racially polarized voting. And my guess is the state redistricting commission's already determined there's racially polarized voting throughout Central California. So that would have to be a consideration that we consider. So the question is not whether the whole district is, but whether an individual zone could be drawn in such a way that you get to 50% CVAP. So I don't know that I explained that very well, so that was a good question. I'm thankful for that. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I'm a little confused.
Okay.
I mean, if you're drawing the lines, you can certainly make the zone so it has that, right?
You can. Well, actually, we already know that if this board were to decide they wanted to keep this district the same. Now, the hard part is that your districts have such a population inequality, because it's been a while, that some of these zones are going to have to be drawn significantly. So that's the hard part about these existing maps. To be frank, I don't have another area I'm working in the state of California where we have such population discrepancies on these districts. I know you're fixing that right now, so I'm not saying that in, what's that?
We'll take it as a compliment.
Oh, okay, great. Well, that's wonderful. All right, you should do that. But it stands out. And so when we're drawing these districts, adjusting the lines to have population equality, which is the first set of standards, then the next question is, now can you draw Voting Rights Act districts with Latino populations? And that's kind of undecided. My team hasn't done that yet, right? We just simply looked at, and by the way, we literally just got this information on Wednesday. We quickly turned it around to try to do it. So we're kind of building this plane as we fly. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if you would know the answer, but I'm curious when the last time these lines were redrawn was.
I'm told it was like 30 years ago, right?
1990.
Yeah, so it's been a while. Yeah.
Okay, then that could explain the
I think
inequality.
it does explain.
Oh, it does explain. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, for some parts of California, well, as you're driving around, you can see some areas of California where like, oh, there's been no new housing here in the last 20 years. That's not the case in Tulare County. There are whole parts and whole neighborhoods that didn't exist 20 years ago that we're going through. So any questions on the Voting Rights Act overall? Too much detail, not enough? Make sure I'm move through this. All right, well, I want to go back. So most people, when they come and talk about redistricting in public comments, they're talking about communities of interest. And communities of interest kind of means all things to all people. You're a healthcare district, right? And so you might look at locations to healthcare facilities. But if people want to come in and talk about their community of interest as a local dog park or a place of worship or a school district or whatever, they're all right. There's nothing wrong about the different communities of interest. Sometimes people look at their community very differently than we might do. We had people argue in the last redistricting commission that LAX was a community of interest and baggage claim couldn't possibly be together or couldn't possibly be separated from the place where the airplanes landed. I don't know why that mattered. We're not talking about any people, but they said they needed to be together. Okay, that's their community of interest. So it is something that you just have to go through, and oftentimes you see local government bodies arguing about communities of interest over inanimate objects, like the Staples Center in Los Angeles. That was a huge debate about which district it was in. Nobody lives there, to my knowledge, or was counted in that process. So anyway, communities of interest is why people will come and talk to you, and they're all right, and you just need to know that, and most of the time. So compactness is rarely an issue. Oftentimes there are a lot of very fancy academic equations that I could bore you all to death with in terms of trying to get to circles and squares and all kinds of things that people think are compact. But the reality is that the boundaries of our special districts and cities and counties aren't squares and triangles. We have mountains, and they sometimes don't look as pretty as we might like. And so compactness hasn't been a reason that I'm aware of that any districts have been thrown out in California, really at all. So this is an issue that is important. As we're going through these maps, there is the issue of contiguity, and California law no longer allows point contiguity, where two districts, their only way of touching, if this was a district where their only point would be this one little point where they're touching. That isn't allowed, right? And you still don't, even if they could allow it, the idea, and actually for some cities, for those of you who are familiar with city boundaries in California, sometimes you have islands of a sewer treatment plant or whatever else. And so you look for where is that area attached to by a road. And so in my example here, on the left, you have point contiguity. That's all great, but you have two different districts where they're divided by a mountain range. those people on the mountain range don't cross back and forth. The people who are together are likely on the same side of that mountain range. That's how they're functionally contiguous. They work together. And so you want to be able to drive across the district or bike or do something to be able to move around in the district. And so when we talk about contiguity, sometimes people just say, well, it just needs to be one nice little circle, and that's all great. But can people move around to be able to get from one part to another? You don't run all the way a district all the way around and connect the population in the southwest corner of Visalia with the northeast corner and say, oh, they're contiguous because you can walk in the farm fields all the way around. That doesn't make sense. That's not functionally contiguous. So I know this has been an issue here in Tulare County. 20 years ago when I worked in the legislature on redistricting, I had a really cool computer and I had all the data, and there were like 8 of us who had all this data, and we could draw districts all day long. In the way that finance and stock trading has been democratized with all of these Robinhood accounts or whatever, redistricting is the same way. The ability for people to draw these things on their phones in meetings or an iPad is incredible. So one of the issues, and it's probably a good time to talk about it right now, is there are all of these different apps that are available for redistricting that are free tools for the publics to use. And by the way, if I was picking one, Dave's Redistricting app, which is DRA 2020, it's just Dave's Redistricting. You can find it online. You can go draw all kinds of maps there. They're really good. It's a free app that's available to the public. Here's the issue though. Your boundaries, which we had to work really hard to try to get, the city of Visalia's boundaries are already in there. Tulare's counties boundaries are already in there. Your healthcare district's not in there, and I don't think Dave's is ever going to put it in there. So as we're going through this process, people have the opportunity to use Representable or District R or any of these other tools to be able to come up with their own maps, and they're free to do that, and they can do it on Dave's. It's just not as easy as if you were to go there and pull down a county as your starting place or your city to be able to do that. And so as we're going through this process, and I mentioned the idea of being open and transparent as we go through this process, my commitment to this board was, when we talked prior to this meeting, was if people want to draw maps, let me and my team know, work through the board or the board secretary or whatever. We'll be happy to work with you to create whatever map you want to be able to balance that out. And so if that's the way you'd like to do it, we can do paper maps. 10 years ago in Elk Grove, I had a gentleman who drew a map on the back of a placemat, and he drew it out, and that actually is the map that the city of Elk Grove is using today, because we put it into the computer, he liked it, he advocated for his map, and it passed. So we want to be able to facilitate people doing that, but these tools have limits for special districts in California because they're not automatically loaded in there like cities and counties are. So there's some ways we can do that with paper maps that my team's working on to help you all if people want to submit paper maps with the populations on it so they can figure it out. My team will work with you, and you could also use these tools, but they're not perfect in the case of a special district. So I just want to point that out. Communities of interest, I talked about that. Still doesn't, district-wide census results, we broke it down by zone, so I still can't answer your question about overall on there. And then you all can see these different numbers if you have individual questions about the different zones that are on here that we attached. So that is my presentation. I think I hit all the key points. Mr. Chair, how can I help you?
I actually was intrigued by the jingles factors.
Okay.
That you didn't mention but were in the presentation. So can you explain what that is, please?
Yes, I can. Okay. So jingles factors are from a Supreme Court case, and it's about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And so this is, when you're drawing a district, the first, I'll just read it to you for those of you who can't read it. A minority group must be sufficiently large and geographically compact to comprise a majority of the district. So if you just said, we have a Latino population that's 25% of this district, but it's all evenly spread out throughout the whole, zones, not districts. I'm trying, I'm not doing very well, but I'm trying. We have 25% of the Latino population is spread throughout the entire state of California, and it's evenly spread out. You wouldn't be able to draw a district if the population's evenly spread out that is majority Latino because it's evenly spread throughout the whole area. And actually, just demographically so you know, that's actually what's happening with the African American community in California. They're all just kind of spreading out all over the state. We don't have large populations of African Americans in California anymore like we did 20 or 30 years ago. And so this factor is do you have a concentrated minority population that you could even draw a zone with that is 50% CVAP? If you can't do that, there's no district that can be drawn under the jingles factor, and you just simply can't get there. There's no concentration where a geographic area was like that. The next factor is the minority group must be politically cohesive. It demonstrates a pattern of voting for the same candidates, also known as block voting. And so we don't know that. We do not have a racially polarized voting analysis, but there are plenty of examples in California where under the jingles test, you would have to say, this population always wanted to vote for a candidate for president or whatever factors. There's all kinds of different judgments here, but do they have a voting pattern indicating that they've been denied their opportunity to elect somebody that they wanted to do, and so wanted to elect? And so some of the best examples of racially polarized voting are actually in Southern California when President Obama ran against Senator Clinton. There were large Latino population blocks that voted for Hillary Clinton and not then Senator Obama, right? And so when they were running against each other, you saw neighborhoods where the Latino population was really large, and that's where Hillary Clinton did the best. And you in the African American areas, you saw where Senator Obama was becoming President Obama, where he did best. And so you look at that and you say, the only thing that's accounting for that is African Americans are voting for one candidate and Latinos are voting for another candidate, and you can see that divide. And that's used to determine whether there is racially polarized voting, which is what number 2 is.
I have a question for you. So
Yes.
what's the definition of a minority group? So Tulare County is 65% Hispanic. That may very well be the case for the Kaweah Delta Healthcare District, which then makes them the majority group for the Kaweah Delta Healthcare District.
So it is a historically disadvantaged group, and every court in California, federal, state, whatever, would recognize the Latino community as being a historically disadvantaged group. So I'm very confident in saying that.
That's the definition. It's not
Yes.
the majority of the population, the ethnicity or the race of the majority of the population is the historical definitions of what.
Yes, and I will tell you that I got yelled at. The reason we have the white CVAP number on here is because I got yelled at in another jurisdiction for not having it on here. But the reality is it doesn't matter because the white population is not a historically disadvantaged group. My team puts it on here because we got yelled at. We'd rather just not get yelled at and just go ahead and throw it on there. So that's the honest truth on that. Yes, ma'am.
Matt, thank you for the explanation of the user tax. On the online mapping, does the algorithm consider the jingle factors in any way, shape, or form when you're kind of drawing the boundary?
So that's really funny. Everyone keeps bringing up this algorithm. We don't have an algorithm. There's no algorithm on here. We have all the data by census blocks, block groups, and census tracts. And when we're going through and drawing different districts, there's no algorithm. It simply just has that data within that. So there's no advancement of data on that. This is a good question, though, for another comparison that's important. So when we're doing equal population for the zones, it's every living heartbeat, right? And when we're doing Voting Rights Act, we're talking about CVAP, and I talked about citizens voting age population. When they do census numbers for the equality, they went out and counted every single person. It's required for a count for those people. The CVAP number is actually a survey that was done in 2019, and so if you look at my chart here, it says 2019 CVAP numbers. And so this is a survey that's done. It's the best information that we have available and what we think courts will use to deal with the Voting Rights Act. And so that's why it's basically a survey of information, and the Census Bureau allows us to, I guess there is a little bit of an extrapolation to be able to survey it and tell us which, in areas of the state and census blocks, how many people of these different ethnicities are citizens voting age population. So does that answer your question? Close? I'm trying.
I'm trying to better understand, but
Okay.
it is very informative.
Yes, okay, so I have one other thing now, because that's a great question, and that I would add. You'll also see stars next to all these numbers here for 2020 count and the CVAP number. 2020 count number is important because if you were to go on the Census Bureau's website and you were to draw exactly your district, you'd say, oh, Matt, your numbers are slightly off. And you would be right, and I'll tell you why. California requires that the incarcerated population that is in different state correctional facilities gets reallocated back to where they came from. Now, it's a little bit of a train wreck because if the example I'll use is myself, if I'm sitting in Pelican Bay and they tell me I live at 123 First Street Visalia, they'll put me at 123 First Street Visalia. If they just say I live on First Street Visalia, they randomly assign me to some census block on First Street in Visalia. If they just say Visalia, they randomly assign me somewhere in Visalia. And if all they say is Matt's from Tulare County, they randomly put me in Tulare County. And some of these people, they don't even addresses for at all. So they really don't end up counting in redistricting purposes. They get zeroed out of Pelican Bay and they're not assigned anywhere. So that's why, in terms of if you were to look at my numbers, you would say, Matt, you're off by 0.05%. You would be right, but those are the numbers we're supposed to use for redistricting. So I just want to convey that right now. Before the question comes up, when somebody goes, I caught you, you're off by 10 people. No, I'm not. I got it right. Yes, ma'am.
Apropos to the previous question, when you mentioned that the census does not come up with the CVAC numbers.
The Census Bureau does.
The Census Bureau does,
Yes.
but it's in their annual.
It's an annual update, and they do, but was not part of the census count. So there was no question, there was no citizenship question on the census data. So they used the survey data from 2019, and that's what we use. You good there? Okay.
So I guess my question is, are jingles factors, or however you pronounce it, are jingles factors something that we would consider in this process?
Well, the reality is that, to my knowledge, there's not plans to do a racially polarized voting analysis, but I would tell you that the State Commission has determined that all of Tulare County for both Assembly, Senate, and Congress was an area that it required where all three jingles conditions were met, and I know that. And a lot of groups will, in my local redistricting, if those areas are covered in the state redistricting things, they often bring that up, and it happens in San Bernardino, and I'm sure it'll happen here in Tulare. So I'm prepared to be able to deal with that. That was kind of a long-winded question to answer your question. You're good though?
No, I'm good with it.
Okay.
Just that you're going to use it as you need to.
Well, you kind of either have to plan for it or not, and I think you have to plan for it because the reality is that if look, I would not recommend to your board a map that didn't meet the population equality standard, right? It's pretty easy. It's very objective. You divide the number, you're either within the zone or you're not. Voting Rights Act is a little bit different, but I have a pretty good idea what the legal standard is where somebody would come and challenge us, and we want to finish this process, be open and transparent the way we go through it, and make sure in the end we don't end up with a legal challenge, right? We want it to go and meet the legal standards. I've never had a map overturned, and I don't want to have that happen.
That's reassuring.
Yes, ma'am.
How long have you been in business?
Well, I've been doing this, she asked how long I've been doing this. So my firm, Redistricting Insights, has only been around since 2017, but I did redistricting in the legislature in 2000, and I worked hard on it in 2010. But the reality is redistricting is only a business that's really around once every 10 years, right? And so it's not a good thing to stick with, but we just finished the state of New York, and so we've been doing redistricting projects all over the country, and this is, we're kind of wrapping up the state projects, and now we're doing a lot of local government stuff. So
And where are you headquartered?
I live in Woodland, California, and so I have staff in Long Beach and 2 people in Sacramento.
Okay, you have a question, sir?
I don't have a question, I have more of a statement. So based on the data that you have provided and the zones that we have in the area where we live here in Tulare, the cities like Goshen, the Oval, and Ivanhoe, I think it's fair to say that we need 3 Latino zones, 2 Latino CVAPs above 50%, and most importantly, we need the deviation to be at 2%. And I'm getting this data because I've been working on redistricting for the county of Tulare, and I know the numbers like the back of my head. And I want to quote what he said, that the Latinos are 62.5% in the county. So I think we can get there. I think we since the last time we did redistricting here for Kaweah Delta Health, I think we have the numbers. I think that the map that was going to be configured by you guys and us, the public, we can definitely get there. That's my comment or question. Or
Can you restate the numbers you said, sir?
I would like to see 3 Latino zones, 2 Latino CVAPs, and have the deviation to be below our 2%.
Okay, other comments from anybody in the public or anybody from the board, questions?
Oh, what's your timeline?
Well, somebody may be able to clarify exactly when Tulare County would like these maps, but generally they want them by mid-April.
Yeah,
Do you have an exact date? I don't remember the exact date for Tulare County.
Marks on the line here, but we want to be entirely done by the end of April. But I think we're targeting sooner than that.
And the reason they want that is the county has a lot of precincts they need to draw up. They have needs to administer a fair and good, well-processed elections. And so as we're going through this process, we want to be good local government colleagues and try to get them the stuff they need.
So will there be a schedule of public meetings or?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, the next meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, February the 9th at 5:30 p.m.
In this room.
In this room.
Yes, sir?
So this gentleman here has some very specific ideas about how he feels that the zone should be redrawn. So his option or responsibility or whatever to bring this forward, is it for him to draw maps that meet what his ideas are to submit that?
Yeah, so well, this gentleman or anyone in this room, if you had a map that they wanted to consider, either they can use their own resources to draw a map, or they can send it to us in paper form, or we can help them draw it, however they want to do it for a public submission. Oftentimes, after this meeting or after the first meeting, the board oftentimes sends my team and I away and say, hey, come back to us with 5 options, 3 options, whatever, so just a bunch of options, right? And so we then try to give you a whole bunch of different starting points. And so this gentleman or other people may say, well, Matt, I really hate maps 1 through 4, but we can work with 5 and let's make some amendments to it and we can find one we like. Some people just say, nope, I want to start from whole cloth and do it themselves. But to be really honest, we just got your current zones on Wednesday, and I haven't looked that closely in terms of the different ways to do it. And so, but yeah, your population deviations are pretty large right now, and so we have some work to do, and my team does too. And so, whatever thoughts or comments you might like to share with me tonight, I can take back to my team so we can try to get you maps that reflect your desires in terms of communities of interest you think that are good. Yes, sir.
I think if I'm following you correctly, I mean, you're going to start with the population equality.
Always.
You're going to try to be as tight as you can. And so that's going to be kind of your starting point. Then you're going to look at the Federal Voting Act and the ethnicity distribution and trying to get that 50%. And so there may only be one way. There might be 5 ways that achieve that objective. And so one of those options might be exactly what this gentleman is suggesting or recommending, that it just happens to come out that way because of the way the population is now distributed. And so we don't know at this point. Since it hasn't been done so long, I have no idea what your map's going to look like initially out of the gate. But depending on where the concentrations of people are and the ethnicity, and we might end up exactly with that.
So usually when I walk into this room and do this presentation, I do know. I can honestly tell you I don't know in your case, and I actually have no idea. I don't really know. This gentleman could be right. He really could be. But one thing I would say, if you don't mind me, sir, can I respond to your comments? Is that all right? You okay with that? So the legal requirement for CVAP very well may be a legal one that's required. So 2 Latino CVAP districts could very well be likely, or maybe it's 3. I don't really know. If a community population equality, Then we get to the Voting Rights Act. And CVAP is a measurement of the Voting Rights Act. Whether it be 2 districts, 3 districts, 4 districts, whatever, that doesn't mean that it doesn't meet the CVAP district, that it's totally not at issue in terms of the redistricting process, because you can have pockets of population that are, maybe for our examples here, we were using districts that were 20,000 people as an example. Well, maybe you don't have a community that's 10,000 that can control a district that would be half a district, but maybe it's 4,000. But then it falls under the community of interest guideline. Maybe it's an Asian population. It doesn't fall under the Voting Rights Act analysis, but you say, why would we want to split that community up? It's a community, it's an ethnicity. It doesn't fall under the Voting Rights Act to be able to be held together because it doesn't meet all those jingles factors that we talked about, right? It's not large enough, but it's a community of interest. It belongs to be held, it should be held together in terms of the way that we do the maps. And so the gentleman's comment is about the 2 CVAP districts. That's a Voting Rights Act argument. The 3 Latino districts, my guess is if it didn't meet the Voting Rights Act requirements with CVAP, then he would be making a community of interest argument that you have 2 that meet the Federal Voting Rights Act requirement, and you have another community that should be held together because of the makeup of the community, but not citizens vote age population. Is that fair? Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, so if the other one wouldn't reach 50%,
Yeah.
it would be 48, 49% is what I have, but it's completely fair what you're saying.
And so then there is also the debate about, because it's a survey, right, for CVAP numbers, not an actual count. I'll tell you the number's 50% that people are shooting for, but if you can get to 48% sometimes, that would be enough that the court would look at it and say, hey, that's close enough. Because it's a survey, there's a margin of error that it very well could be slightly over, slightly under. So 50% would be the magical number generally. But even if it's right at 50%, there's about a 50% likelihood it's slightly under or slightly over. So because it's a survey, there's some error that we deal with. But if you get to 50%, most courts say they work to do their job, they're good.
On February 9th, what will happen?
Well, if the board directs me tonight, my understanding is that I will be coming back to you with some suggested maps, and then we might consider talking about them. But
So you will be generating maps. You will be generating maps.
Mm-hmm.
And then if there are any community maps that come in, would you present those, or would you have the community, the authors of the map, would they have an opportunity, like 10 or 15 minutes, to present their maps?
Well, that's up to the board in terms of how they want to govern that process. But usually if they make a submission, board, I'll just tell you this is the way it's traditionally done before. You can veto this or whatever, but the key deal on maps is notice. People need to be able to do that. So if somebody were to walk in this room right now and say, hey, I want to share my map with you, the board can't consider that, right? It's got to be noticed so people can feel it, touch it, look at it, right? 7 days. 7 days, right? So my maps will be done 7 days before that meeting. And so oftentimes people are very disappointed when they walk into a room with a map and they want 15 minutes, but we can't talk about their map because they didn't get it to us in time. And so as we're going through this process, that notice requirement is important. And what I would do is they could certainly have the opportunity to speak in public comment about map 8 or whatever else, but I would, if given it in advance, my team would do exactly the same breakdown for their maps as the public, exact same data. We just call it public submission 1 or 2 or 9 or how many ever we get with that same data broken down. And as I was talking to this woman from the city council earlier, if we end up drawing a map and somebody really wants to submit a map that only has 100 people in a district, it'd be my obligation to tell them, hey, your district's too small, it needs to be bigger population equality. But if they say, hey, Matt, pound sand, I want to submit this one with 100 people, well then it's a free country and they can do that and we'll help them do that. But I would have to tell the board, I strongly recommend that you don't adopt this map. There's only 100 people in this district. This thing's going to get tossed because you violate the population equality provision.
In other words, you will do an analysis on it.
I would do an analysis, but in the end, the board gets to decide which map they're going to choose, and they can choose to ignore my advice. But in that extreme example I just gave you, I would be obligated to tell the board, hey, don't do this. That's not going to fly.
Jurisdictions, we've been sitting in on the processes for different jurisdictions, and one jurisdiction we sat in on gave every map author 15 minutes, and they could even do a slideshow, and most of them did a slideshow, to explain the thinking behind their drawing of the map, which the supervisors found to be useful, and the commissioners also found to be useful to understand where they were coming from. You know.
That wasn't done until they were reviewed by the 7 days went by.
Oh, no, the 7 days that they always
Yeah,
stuck to that.
they were looked at by criteria before they were got up and on.
Yeah.
In other words, you could review them and then you give them a chance to speak.
Well-
Are you okay that they were?
Well, I don't know K-maps. I'm going to do my analysis, and then the board gets to decide that. But then in terms of the way they run these meetings, in terms of the time allocation, that's entirely up to those people behind you.
Because I know it's been a frustration for authors of maps not to be able to have the opportunity to explain their thinking.
I'm 100% sure I'm going to break this podium if you have. It just feels like it's going to snap.
Yeah, so what I want to say is that I want to draw a map. At the same time, I want to have the opportunity to present to you guys 10 minutes of why I'm drawing the way I'm drawing, why the communities of interest I think are the way they are, and to piggyback of what the lady's saying, would that be permitted by the board, by you guys, to allow me to speak on my map and say, this is why I drew my map, and this is how I feel about my map. And, you know, I want it to be within compliance with the law, and make sure I get an analysis from John, sir? Matt, sorry. By Matt, and that way, you know, my map can be considered as an adoption, right? That's what ultimately what we want to happen.
Well, speaking for myself, I would expect that, and I'm not speaking for the rest of the board, they can chime in on their own. Speaking for myself, if you take the time to put a map together, we certainly want to respect your work and take a look at the option. I listened to the Elk Grove back of a place map that was picked and used for the city redistricting, and so there's merit in everybody's idea. The issue is, as I understand it from listening to Matt, there's a time frame for submission of that. And certainly, if any maps get submitted, from my perspective, we can give you 15 minutes to explain your map, because we're going to listen to his reasoning for all the maps that he's going to draw. So I think that's fair and appropriate to the process that I'm expecting us to use here. And I have board members, you can chime in as you want to on that.
I love the idea of the public participating, and I would love for maps to be given as far as like 7-day notice and meet the requirements. And yeah, I want to see the presentation. That'd be awesome.
So what we would do, with the board's permission then, so my maps will come in the PDF form like you have, but in addition to that, there would be a link that would be available to you on Google Maps, where you'd be able to look at those individual districts, and then, because PDFs are great, but in the end you can't really focus down on the individual thing. And on Google Maps you can go right down and figure out whether your favorite fast food restaurant's in the middle of there, or a park, or whatever you want to look up to be able to determine that. And we found that that's been very helpful for people who want to really dial in, because sometimes, you know, whether it's a street north or south of another one, Google Maps can tell you that, whereas the PDF's not so great. So I would do the same thing with the public submission maps as well. We'd load them into Google Maps, and we'd have submission, or, you know, consultant submission 1, 2, and 3, public submission 1, 2 through 9, or whatever it is. Same, treated exactly the same for the board to choose.
February 2nd would be the date that would be required for you to get your map submitted as a public individual, so that Matt could, is that correct? That's 7 days before?
Yeah, but that's when you need to post them. I probably need 24, 48 hours. We could do it as quickly as we can. We will treat everyone as fairly as we possibly can, but I need at least a day or two to get them loaded and drawn.
The date you need, you talk about, if we're going to meet on the 9th, then February 1st, or?
That would be great, yeah.
Okay, then February 1st would be the time to get the map.
And I mean, I know that's, but we have other meetings too, so there will be other opportunities for people to be able to do this. And one of the difficult issues for the board is, if somebody comes in with a map on the final day, even though it's supposed to be posted 7 days in advance, it happens. And so we've had to do analysis kind of on the fly to be able to do that, because you're planning on adopting a map that day.
But we're not planning on adopting a map until we get to April.
No, I understand that.
We plan to meet next month, and we plan to meet also in March.
But-
So
but-
we've got a time frame, but I understand.
Some people show up in April, right?
What you want to do, right, so. But we want to respect everybody's map and all their efforts, and particularly given the way things have changed over the last several years, we really need to respect that opportunity. And so,
I would just say, I think we should move it maybe a day ahead, like the 31st is the first. I think giving Matt's firm another day would be helpful, especially if there's back and forth. So if we say it needs to get to Matt by the
Yeah.
31st.
In a perfect world, what we would like to do is if somebody submitted it to us, we'd put it into the same systems ours in, send it back to them and have them say, hey, look at your stuff, make sure this is an accurate presentation of what you want. They give us a thumbs up and then we send it on to,
A day or two business days.
that would be helpful.
Go back and forth.
That would be helpful. We want to be fair to everyone and we want to do it right.
well, and just so you know, the 31st is a week from now. So, but I think it's good for us to try to do that, meet that as best we can, but understanding there are people who aren't here tonight who will maybe want to put maps in place or whatever, who will be showing up with a map for us to look at.
And I think it'd probably be helpful to post the information that I don't know if you want to post that we're seeking submissions.
Yeah, or we can, you
And
can
the
send out
deadlines there.
notifications to folks so that people who are interested can get a sense of the time frame. Yes, ma'am.
On February 9th, will you have a schedule of the rest of the meetings that you're planning?
I'm sure we will.
Great, thank you.
And will there be what's the drop deadline for final submissions of public maps?
Yeah, we will.
Before you have
We
to
will.
make a decision.
Right. Yeah, when we get to, we're planning on meeting each of the next February and March, and then finalizing in April, and so we'll publish a deadline that you can't submit a map after that day.
And your legal counsel will tell you you're going to have to submit it to accept maps says right up to the very end, just so you know. You can say whatever you want, sir, but I'm just telling you the way it's going to work.
Hold on. Sorry. Comment? Mike?
I just wanted to say that these are all good comments by both the public and the board, and I agree, especially with MR and dictates that we need to have the public maps, the folks that go to the trouble to put those together and submit them, we can have them.
Okay, any other questions or comments relative, ma'am, you want to make a comment?
I just wanted to say, I've been to a whole bunch of these meetings. This was really well done. I thought that was a great presentation.
Well, that's nice. Thank you.
Clarified things. I probably heard, but learned new things. So,
Oh.
Thank you.
That's very nice. Thank you for that. Everyone just yells at me. That's really nice.
All right, anybody else, any more comments from anyone in the audience? Board members, any comments from you? And I think we have our idea of where our task is and where we're going, and so with that, I would adjourn the meeting. Thank you all for coming.